Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the anonymous 15th century poem, Lament of the Virgin, which is a religious poem, as the title suggests. It is a lyric poem written from the perspective of the Virgin Mary following the death of her son, Jesus. And the basic premise, which recurs repeatedly over the 10 stanzas of the poem, is, woman, compare your happiness in having your child alive to my sadness in my son's death. So we really get this sort of direct address at the beginning of most of the stanzas, starting with the second one. There are a few stanzas that vary from this, but most stanzas begin with a direct address to women or mothers, more specifically. So the second stanza begins with, "O woman, woman, well is thee." The third stanza, "O woman, a chaplet chosen thou has." Fourth stanza, "O woman, look to me again." Fifth stanza, "O woman, thou takes thy child by the hand." Fifth stanza, "Therefore women by town and street." Sixth stanza doesn't specifically mention women, but it is still a direct address to the reader or listener. "Thou hast thy son full whole and sound." And with the eighth stanza, we expand a little bit. "Weep with me both man and wife." Ninth stanza goes back. "Now all women that have your wit." That may be the 10th stanza. Yeah, I may have miscounted some of those. Doesn't matter. My point is, this is very clearly addressed primarily to women, although the reality is that while the subject of address would be women, this is in fact a poem directed at everyone. And again, the entire premise is, your child is alive, you are so lucky compared to me. Think about my suffering, think about the suffering of my child, Jesus, who has just been crucified. So we take this second stanza. "O woman, woman, well is thee, thy child's cap thee dotes upon. Thou picks his hair, beholds his blee. Thou wast not well when thou hast done. But ever, alas, I make my moan to see my son's head as it is here. I pick out thorns by one and one, for now lies dead my dear son dear." So again, this is entirely about building that contrast. Your living child compared to my dead child. And this is not meant to be like, you should feel guilty for having kids when my kid is dead, or pity me as such. Although pity me is a big component of it. What this is be grateful, reflect on my son's sacrifice so that your child could live and live eternally in Christian theology. Let me find this bit. So if we look at the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8th stanza, for instance, "Thou hast thy son full whole and sound, and mine is dead upon my knee. Thy child is loose, and mine is bound. Thy child is alive, and mine dead is he. Why was this aught but for thee? For my child trespassed never here. Methinks ye beholden to weep with me, for now lies dead my dear son dear." That line, "Why was this aught but for thee?" This is, of course, the sort of key theological point of the poem, that in Christian doctrine, in Catholic doctrine, medieval Catholic doctrine, Jesus sacrifices himself for the sake of everyone, to save us. We are redeemed by Jesus' sacrifice, or as it's often put in medieval literature, Jesus bought us with his death. And so why was this aught but for thee? Why did my son Jesus have to die except for your benefit? And that's, again, not a recrimination. That's not, I blame you for my son's death. That is, reflect on the sacrifice of my son, reflect on the suffering of my son, reflect on my suffering as a mother, which you can envision, you can empathize with, because you are also a mother, and use that as a basis for strengthening your devotion to Jesus, to the Virgin Mary, to God, and to the Church on earth. This is what's called affective piety. And this was a major thing in the medieval period, and still is today in Christian religious practice. Affective piety is basically the idea that what we should be concerned with and what we should be focusing on in our religious art, depiction, theater, services, etc., is the emotional impact of Christ's suffering, the Virgin Mary's suffering, the loss felt by Mary Magdalene, etc., etc. And so all of the, like, this is a thing in the early church, especially the Roman period church into the early medieval period. You have a lot of depictions of Christ triumphant, right? Christ overcoming death. And it is much more this sort of theological focus on the idea of eternal life through the redemption offered by Jesus' sacrifice. But as you get into sort of the middle of the medieval period, especially into the high medieval period, and this would be well established by the 15th century when this poem was written, you have a turn, in an institutional turn in the Catholic Church itself that then radiates outward to a focus on suffering and depictions of suffering and sympathy and empathy generated for Jesus. This is why every Catholic church you go into has a crucifix with a statue of suffering Jesus. This is why you have so many medieval, late medieval, and Renaissance, early modern era paintings of Jesus suffering, Jesus on the cross, of Mary, Virgin Mary, and or Mary Magdalene, and or whoever, weeping for the death of Jesus. The Piety is a great example of affective piety, right? It is entirely about this heart-wrenching scene of suffering. And what this does is really kind of clever because it couples but also really supplants the intellectual side of theology. You don't necessarily, it's good that people think about religious doctrine, but that's not really that important at the end of the day, as long in medieval Catholicism, because it was more about participating in the rituals and doing as the church commanded, right? Going through the sacraments, making your confessions, etc., etc. All of the things that you had to do to be a good medieval Catholic. And the Reformation kind of changes this because that makes it more about faith, whereas for the medieval Catholic Church, faith was probably secondary to behaving properly in these ritualized ways. And there was the assumption, I think, that if you went through the proper rituals, if you behaved correctly, if you took communion, went to confession, if you went to church, etc., etc., that was the external expression of your faith. But affective piety is really, really effective when you don't necessarily care that much whether people are thinking deeply and about theological issues. And in some ways that would not have been to the benefit of the medieval Catholic Church. In fact, when people like Martin Luther, Jan Hus, Calvin, etc., start thinking deeply about theological issues, that really raises some problems for the Catholic Church. But what affective piety is really good at is tying religious feeling to emotion. And emotion is a strong driver. It is a strong way of motivating someone without necessarily requiring them to be intellectually motivated or even persuaded, right? We can feel very strongly about something and therefore behave in the way that that the organization, institution, or individual doing that emotional evocation wants us to, right? This is pathos in rhetoric. And Lament of the Virgin is 100% in this tradition. It is contrasting continually your son or your child is doing these things. Living, happy, doing stuff, playing, whatever it is. My son is dead. Look at the suffering of my son. See I'm pulling the thorns from his head. There's a gash in his side where he's been stabbed with a spear. There's holes in his hands and his feet. And these stanzas are built around these elements of the passion of Jesus. And so it is this continual contrast that is meant to evoke this emotional reaction. Imagine if your son had suffered the way that my son had. Experience empathetically my pain and therefore devote yourself to Jesus, to the Catholic Church. Devote yourself to your religious duties because my son suffered for you and I suffer because of what my son has gone through, so that you do not have to suffer in that way. And it's very effective. Again, it's emotionally very, very powerful.